Welcome to this session of the Plan II Honors Thesis Symposium. Today's topic is finance, economics, and markets. I'm the moderator. I'm Dan Bonevac. I am a professor of philosophy and human dimensions of organizations here at UT. I've been here for 41 years. So I kind of feel like this is my home and I was almost a native here. In any case, welcome. We're happy to have you along. We're going to have a series of presentations today, and I hope you'll ask questions, but I ask you to do it by submitting them in the chat section. And then they will be reviewed and asked when the opportunity is right. Well, we have three speakers today. The first one is Francisca Guerrero Jurado, and she is going to be talking about an analysis of the development of Chinese e-commerce. So Francisca, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you. I'm going to quickly try to share my screen now. And there we go. Okay. So hi, everyone. My name is Francisca, and I'm an accounting and Plan II double major. And my thesis title has actually changed since I started writing it to the regulatory and technological development of Chinese e-commerce and response to the global pandemic. The core statement in my thesis is that the modern Chinese economy can be understood by analyzing its historic and modern changes. But what do I mean by that? To explain, I will start with my internship and how it influenced my thesis. I will then reintroduce and dissect my thesis. And finally, we will revisit my thesis, given the information you have learned throughout my presentation. But first, I have a question for you. Would you intern in a country where you do not know the language spoken? If yes, put up a check mark. If not, put up an X. And hopefully there will be more yeses than nos. Okay, so I'm glad. It seems like most people would. Well, that's great because that's actually exactly what I did when I made my first trip to China the summer after my sophomore year with my high school friend to intern at an investment firm in Shenzhen, despite not knowing a word of Chinese. Although my supervisor and the internship coordinators spoke English, most everyone else did not. So I relied on Google Translate and pointing to get around, which made for a very interesting, fun, and insightful experience. My internship was particularly insightful because it taught me two things. One, communicating is more than just knowing the language. And two, the modern Chinese economy is technologically intertwined. What I mean by that is that it is largely an e-commerce fueled economy. In China, everyone communicates via WeChat, a multi-purpose messaging, social media, and mobile payment app developed by Tencent, a multinational technology giant akin to Alibaba or Amazon in the US, and first released in 2011. The app allows you to add other apps or plugins called mini programs to order fast and cheap delivery and shop on giant virtual shopping malls like Alibaba's Tmall Global. So in my thesis, when I mention a modern Chinese economy, I'm referring to an e-commerce economy, largely run by huge technology giants like Alibaba in red, the Tencent and JD Alliance in black, and Baidu in dark gray, which actually border on being oligopolies. Okay, so if this is a modern Chinese economy, then what were the historic changes that led up to it, and why do I mention modern changes in my thesis? Well, what I mean by historic is I'm referring to the Mao and post-Mao era economic policies. specifically China's open door policy, which opened China to foreign investments and scientific modernization, leading to mass urbanization and reforms experimentally applied in SECs or special economic zones, like where I did my internship, Shenzhen, that spurred industrialization. This has supported China's transformation from a capital-oriented economy toward a knowledge-based economy. In other words, less focus on industrialization and product output and more on building its own knowledge base of science and technology. This leads us to the explosion of growth in e-commerce that has occurred during the pandemic. According to a report published by Salesforce in April 2020, the number of unique digital shoppers rose 40% year over year, with digital shoppers driving 20% revenue growth compared to 12% in Q1 of 2019. Growth that actually outperformed the pre-global pandemic 2019 holiday shopping season and showed a decreasing gap between stronger physical store performance and lagging e-commerce sales. When in fact, just 10 years ago, e-commerce had been only at 5.1% of total retail purchases. And surprisingly, unlike many other countries, China saw economic growth in 2020. In fact, the Chinese economy rose 2.3% last year, according to the National Bureau of Statistics. This growth is surprising because when the virus emerged in Wuhan, travel and business ground to nearly a halt, shrinking the economy by 6.8% in the January to March period, compared with 2019, the first contraction in nearly half a century. Luckily, the government took action immediately by completely locking down multiple affected areas, constructing hospitals in record time, and providing lifeblood to the economy through stimulus measures. These stimulus measures were investing in infrastructure, stimulating consumer spending, especially through e-commerce, and providing incentives for businesses. So finally, we can now go back to my thesis and actually use it to summarize and reflect on everything we've kind of learned in this short time. So we learned that this past year, there has been an explosive growth in e-commerce due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and China has capitalized on this more than other countries. We can say that because its GDP grew in 2019, while that of other major economies declined. And we can explain this economic resilience by looking at the modern Chinese economy and understanding it by tracing it to Mao and post-Mao era government regulations, specifically China's open door policy, which ushered in outside knowledge that the government is now trying to cultivate by turning inward and focusing on national spending and growth. And I guess the question now for further inquiry is, could the US and other major economies do the same? And that is all. Thank you.
All right, questions. Here is one. What were some of your experiences or things you learned from your internship that led you to choose this thesis topic?
Right. So I really liked during my internship how I was working at an investment firm, and so I got to figure out what it actually meant to like invest in companies and in terms of long-term investments. And that meant like being a consumer, me going and actually using WeChat and having friends that had WeChat actually helped me pay for things through WeChat. And then going and like asking for delivery and just like navigating through that. So that was really fun, and that really got me thinking, especially when I was trying to come up with a Plan II thesis about what could have like what in China was like, I guess the core, which I see as e-payments of what of how e-commerce works. So that was fun.
All right, another question on adding to that one.
Mm-hmm.
How did your time in China give you deeper insight than you would otherwise have had while researching your topic? What do you think you gained by actually going to China?
Right. Well, I guess kind of like what I kind of just said, I guess what I gained from that is just a better perspective on like how things work in China, why it's possible for there to be this government stimulus of the economy, why things like WeChat are so big, and why other things that we see here in the US, like big shop, like for example, like Costco, like why don't people buy in bulk in China? Things like that became much more apparent and practical to me there.
Oh, good. Thank you. Here's the next question. First of all, comment, what a wonderful project.
Thank you.
Congratulations on a terrific set of findings. What do you make of the so-called post-pandemic growth in China, even though shoppers, for example, are still somewhat skittish? In other words, is your proposal that it might happen here as well post-pandemic?
I'm thinking that here in the US, we definitely do see this whole thing that's going on in China with e-payments. Like that definitely is going to become much bigger. And I think that there definitely will need to be some sort of like, right now in China, the government has been stimulating the economy, but it's going to have to come to the actual consumers, the nation actually wanting to spend again. And so I think it's largely going to be that. Like here in the US, we're also getting stimulus payments, but moving forward, it's going to have to be people wanting to use technology more, and through that wanting to be able to contribute to economic growth.
I have a question myself, if I can insert that, which is, what was the main difference you saw between the Chinese economy and the American economy? And also, how much of that do you think was due to the pandemic? How much of that is going to survive once both economies have gotten back to normal, if I can talk in such terms?
For your first question, I actually, as I was doing my project, I realized there were a lot of similarities in terms of how things are going right now in China, especially in terms of like how these big companies like Alibaba and Tencent are actually starting to get regulated by the government. So I saw those things, and I don't know if per se it was too much. It was more like in China, there's a lot of these big companies that have just taken over, like run with e-commerce, and just decided to, like I said, like become oligopolies in that space. And I don't know if we quite see that yet in the US, but I feel we're like how Amazon's going. We might as well start seeing more companies take over certain spaces. But yeah, it's much more debated than, like, say in China, we only have like Alipay and WeChat really for payments online. I don't know if that will ever be like here in the US. What was your second part?
Oh, the second part was just how do you think things will change in this comparison once the effects of the pandemic have washed out and we're sort of back to normal, if we'll ever get back to anything called normal?
Right. Yeah, so I think it's not, I think we're just gonna progress from here in terms of using more. I mean, yeah, there's definitely, both in China and US, there's definitely a lot of people that probably wouldn't adhere to e-commerce becoming the thing, that they're not as technologically savvy as other younger consumers, and that's going to be hard. But I definitely see how, like, because of pandemic, the US might just see there might be more of a push to go towards e-payments and making things online more integrated and easier. Kind of like we have those environments in China with these big companies that kind of rule their little e-commerce environments.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Next question. Is there any factor that could cause a turnaround or a regress, do you think, of the e-commerce growth we've seen in both China and the US?
I'm not sure. I feel like maybe if there's just a lot of people that, well, I mean, in China, it's like it's a thing now. It's like both businesses and like and you know, average consumers have been doing this, embracing it quite willingly, especially because it's just become so much easier for everyone. So actually, I see that growth kind of hard to overturn. Maybe here in the US, it might be a little, there might be some setbacks, like I said, from simply there being so many different companies that have different like payment systems and then like their own e-commerce systems going on. Like we have like Apple Pay, but not everyone's doing Apple Pay and stuff like that. So I can see how it could be more of a setback here in the US. And, you know, it's kind of scary because in China, you think of WeChat and Alipay, they have your bank account info. And I don't know if a lot of people here in the US are quite ready for that.
I think we then have time for one more question, which is, do you think that the social commerce, the mini programs on WeChat, for example, so prevalent in China, are likely to proliferate in a major way to the US or other parts of the world? Can you see a major shift in shopping habits, for example, from in-store to online purchases to maybe Instagram or Pinterest or Facebook marketplaces and so on, even once the pandemic and so on is not a factor?
Yeah, I think whoever asked that question is right on. Definitely, that is definitely the appeal to WeChat, is that it's kind of like a Facebook and also direct message, and you can pay for things and then ask for delivery. It's like everything you want. So I think that is definitely something that we also see. Like I've seen that Facebook seems to be trying to do those things, seems to be trying to change from social interactions to like, oh, you can pay or you can send things, stuff like that. So I can definitely see how that may also make it a lot easier for us to go down this e-commerce path.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Wonderful job.
Thank you.
And now we are going to shift gears slightly. Our next presentation is by Nolan Pitts, and it's going to be on 2008 and COVID, a model for identifying market bubbles susceptible to over-leveraged securities.
Hello, everyone. Make sure everything's screen shared real fast. All righty. Well, thank you for coming out to our presentation today. Today, I'll be talking about COVID-19, 2008, and identifying market bubbles susceptible to over-leveraged securities. So my name is Nolan Pitts. I'm a Finance Plan II major. And before I begin, I just want to say thank you to my thesis advisor, Professor Dima Shamoon, and my second reader, Professor Ramesh Rao. Without them, this wouldn't have been possible. So I'm going to start with my central question of the thesis. How can we create a model that can identify market bubbles without relying on a set of metrics susceptible to manipulation? So I'll break down a few of those key terms real fast. When I say bubbles, I'm defining it as a stock market with what we come to find out are overinflated prices. So think the tech bubble in 2000, the housing bubble in 2008, and what some would describe today's market as a bubble. The other word that's kind of interesting here is manipulation. I don't necessarily mean illegal manipulation. I merely mean gaming the system by using accounting tricks. For certain metrics like earnings per share, return on equity, you can game the system by moving values around to make them more healthy than the underlying company is. So I propose a two-pronged model, half qualitative, half quantitative. The qualitative part of it is the state of market regulations today. Market regulations help define the risk of the game, the incentive structures we face today. People today look at how people were in the past for their decisions were punished. If they broke the system, pushed the system, did something illegal, they look at how they were punished to then form their own opinions on how risky a certain stretch of the rules might be. The quantitative side is personal debt in America. Personal debt is the amplifier. There's a direct relationship between levels of personal debt and the length and severity of a recession. So the basic idea here is no matter what kind of recession it is, whether it's a banking caused recession like 2008 or one like COVID, where it's an external crisis, if the personal debt levels are high, they're longer recessions and they're more severe. So starting with regulation, what has changed? Well, one of the big talked about things in the news during the whole 2008 crisis was the Dodd-Frank Act, passed in 2010. Some of the major points that I touch on in my actual thesis is the issues with the issuer payment model and the importance of bond ratings. So when a company wants to issue a bond to raise capital, they would bring it to a ratings agencies, and there's only a few large ones, Standard & Poor's, Moody's. They get the rating and they want the highest rating they can get because then they can raise the most money from that bond vehicle. This obviously, but they're also the ones paying these Moody's and Standard & Poor's. So the people who want the higher ratings are also paying the companies that are giving the ratings. And there's an obvious conflict of interest where if I know Moody's is tougher on ratings, I'm just going to go to Standard & Poor's. They try to fix this in Dodd-Frank Act by making it so that the people who work on the ratings cannot be the people who work in sales. But at the end of the day, they have the same executives. It's not two separate companies. So we don't know how effective that actually is. The other issue is the importance of bond ratings. Banks can only take on investment grade or higher bonds, certain size banks. And so the Dodd-Frank try to make this a more comprehensive review rather than being just, if it's BBB or higher, it's good to go. Again, the wording on this is kind of unclear and it's not exactly as hard and fast metric. So we're not really sure how successful that's actually being. The other big thing was the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. This actually was getting billions back in the hands of people who were taken advantage of by lenders or creditors that were taking advantage of whatever situation they might have been in. However, from 2017 on, under Trump's presidency, the person he appointed to this committee was an outspoken critic of it before he was appointed to the position. And so since then, it only has levied one fine against a major bank. Under Biden's presidency, we're not sure. We do know who it's going to be, and they seem to be a bigger proponent of the Bureau. And so hopefully maybe they can get back to using the powers that have been given to the Bureau. Now focusing on personal debt. The private debt to GDP ratio is just looks at businesses, households, everything that isn't federal debt over GDP. So which is gross domestic product. So as you can see, during the 2008 crisis, we were around 224%. So our private debt was 224% greater than our GDP. This dropped after the pandemic, or after the 2008 crisis, but then has stabilized out around 220, which is still extremely high compared to a historical average of around 160. This is household debt. So this breaks out, takes away businesses and purely looks at households, family units, and sees how much debt they have over GDP. As you can see, it fell quite far from the peaks in 2008. It actually did recover quite a bit down to the 75% range. The spike at the end there is from COVID. However, it's most likely from a fall in GDP. In Q2 of 2020, we lost about 33% of our GDP and then recovered about 37% of it in Q3, which hasn't brought us back up to where we should be. But as you can see, it kind of accounts for that sharp spike down in the later parts of the past year. And this graph breaks that last graph down even more into the different types of loans people have today. Where is household debt broken out into? As you can see, the largest one is in mortgages. Most people's debt is in their mortgage. It always has been. It's been the largest portion for at least the past 30 years. However, recently, as you can see, the student loans and auto loans have grown quite a bit. Student loans are up to about $1.5 to $1.7 trillion market, and auto loans are in the $1 trillion area. So while they aren't the same size as mortgages, they're still a very large market. So what does this all mean? I compare it to something that a lot of Texans understand quite well, which is the difference between a thunderstorm watch and a thunderstorm warning. A thunderstorm watch is when the ingredients are there. The cold front's moving through, it's hot outside, the turbulent atmosphere. Texans often claim when they walk outside, they can feel the air's like it's going to rain later, but there is no storm currently. It's just the ingredients are there. A thunderstorm warning means a storm is barreling down on you and you need to get inside. We're in the thunderstorm watch phase. We have the two ingredients. We have the market, the regulatory system with the similar broken incentive structure, and we have the personal debt that is close to what it was in 2008. It's lower in some metrics, but still quite high and elevated compared to historical trends beforehand. We have the ingredients, but we don't necessarily have a storm barreling down on us right yet. So I'll close on what are some possible needles to this bubble. What could pop this bubble that we have currently forming according to this model? I suggest maybe people ask slabs. When I say slabs, I don't mean marble slab ice cream. As great as it isn't a market needle. It's not going to pop the bubble. When I say slabs, I mean student loan asset-backed securities. A lot less fun, but these are very similar to the mortgage-backed securities that helped crash the market in 2008. They work simply, they bundle a bunch of student loans together, an investor buys them, and then they receive the payments, the interest payments from these student loans. The major difference is, and one of the reasons why I don't believe this is a needle that will pop a bubble, is a lot of them are federally backed. All the ones in this chart here that are FFELP or FDLP, or just federal in general, are backed by the federal government. So there is a very low likelihood of just mass defaults in this sector. On top of this, it isn't like a house where if you go into bankruptcy, you foreclose the house, that's the end, you get a fresh start. Sadly, for the people who have student loans, it's almost impossible to get out of them. There have been like the number of court cases of people actually getting out of loans, I can count on one hand. It's just not on the student loans. It's just not very possible. And that's a sad thing for those loan holders, but from an investment security standpoint, it makes them a lot less risky and a lot less prone to a market-wide collapse. So that's all that I have about my presentation. Thank you so much again for coming out, and feel free to ask any questions in the chat. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I want to start with a question, and let me urge people to submit them in the chat if they would like to. The first question that's come in is, doesn't the set of metrics being manipulated in and of itself imply that there's some sort of bubble that could be taking place?
So the key thing with those metrics is if any one metric actually does a good job of encapsulating the market, then then the people who control those metrics in individual companies will know that that's the one they should go and try to make their company look the best in. So when earnings per share kind of became popular a long time ago, and it simply is how much your company earns over how many shares you have out there. Companies knew, okay, now if we buy back our shares and we reduce that denominator, we'll raise the total value as a whole and make that metric look good. And then investors will want to buy our company because we have such a good earnings per share. It's not necessarily indicative of bubble of itself. It's just the natural ebb and flow of people trying to make their companies, trying to make their metrics look good for investors so they get people to buy their stocks. But the key is the usual way to combat that is looking at a bunch of metrics rather than boiling everything down to one number that can easily be kind of fidgeted with. Looking at so many different things that if they were trying to help this metric, they're going to be naturally hurting this metric. So it's kind of moving those things. My model tries to look at more qualitative and market-wide issues like personal debt so that we don't have that manipulation that isn't really illegal or unknown of in the marketplace.
Thank you. The next question is a very direct bottom line one. Is it time to sell market assets?
I would say no. No financial. There's a disclaimer financial advisor is supposed to say because I am not one, and I just take everything I say with a grain of salt. But I would personally say no. It's time to be wary. It's time to maybe diversify into things that do well during markets that aren't very successful during recessions, into certain markets that historically do well. But I certainly wouldn't say it's time to sell. I mean, a lot of these metrics have been true since April of last year. And we've seen what the market has done over the past year. It's had one of the best years it's had ever. So you need to be aware, like a thunderstorm watch. You need to be aware, but don't get inside just yet.
All right, thank you. Next question. First, a comment, great job. But secondly, did you identify any other possible needles in your research?
So I looked at a multiple of the mortgage-backed securities type securities, mortgage-backed, auto-backed. None of them stood out to me. Purely, a lot of the reason why they don't stand out is because people are aware of them now. People didn't understand how mortgage-backed securities worked in 2008. There was a lot of knowingly fraudulent things going on, and people understanding how risky the things they held were. But there's a lot of people who just didn't understand what they were holding, or that they could even fail. So that isn't true much anymore because of movies like The Big Short. And these people, you could say mortgage-backed securities to someone who isn't even involved in finance, and they might actually know what it means. So I believe the risk in that, just because the eyes on that market is lower. I think the bigger risk is something like we call something called stagflation, which is where you have consistent high unemployment and you have inflation. So you have this long period of just not much growth, bad unemployment numbers, and high inflation, which is just a really bad thing for market to experience. It isn't a collapse of asset prices like 2008 or the tech crisis, but it's certainly not something we want. That would be caused more of just by overall economic policy, maybe a rebound in the virus with a new variant, something that just affects the whole economy rather than like one asset class popping the bubble.
Well, thank you. The next question is something I was wondering about too. Wasn't the federal backing of mortgages, for example, Freddie Mae, what allowed lenders to speculate, which worsened the bubble back in 2008? And why won't something like that happen again with student loan debt, since that has been federalized since the Obama administration, to a large extent anyway?
So the big difference between the two is, like I said, the collateral issue of it all. Slabs don't, or student loans, there's nothing, even though the federal government did somewhat help up prop the housing market in 2008, especially by getting so many people on housing loans. There was so many new people were getting loans for houses, mortgages, especially subprime loans where they had no proof of income, so-called NINJA, no income, no job, adjustable rate incomes or loans. That's what kind of created the market. And then when they defaulted, when they bankrupted, when they got fired, whatever it may be, their house, they were forced to bankrupt and foreclose on their home. Student loans, you can't get out from it. There is no collateral. There is no way you can just erase the student loan and move on, and the person holding the other side of that student loan is out of their money. Like I said, I think I found 2 court cases, maybe 3 in my research, that actually where people could meet the criteria necessary to just get their student loans erased. So that's really the big difference, is that source of collateral, especially because so many people had their net worth tied up in their homes that they were simultaneously paying mortgages on. No one has their net worth tied up in their student loans.
A related question maybe. The Fed has had a policy for the last several years of keeping interest rates very low. And that gives people incentives to take on more debt. In fact, I was talking to a philosopher yesterday who said, you should be borrowing everything you can possibly borrow. Get any money a bank will give you for anything. And that seems as if it encourages in short debt, and debt levels are tied into this general danger. So is the Fed's policy, you think, something that's increasing the danger and making a thunderstorm more likely?
I definitely worry that it is, especially in asset classes, just in general, with interest rates so low. You have nowhere else to put your money if you're trying to invest other than the stock market. And you can't buy bonds right now for any reasonable amount of return. I don't know that I would. It's an interesting question. It's definitely something that's I've always focused on it from the asset, like I said, side of it. We're looking at the stock market as a whole. It seems like going forward, we will not see interest rates raising for at least 2 to 3 years. So I do feel like people will be loaning more and taking on more debt. But simultaneously, we've seen that savings for a lot of people have gone up during the pandemic. People saved a lot of the stimulus checks. There was some discrepancies between which levels of income were saving more. So upper levels of income, people making more than $60,000 were saving way more than they usually do. Whereas people who were making under 60,000 were saving about the same as they normally do, and were spending about the same as they normally do, most likely because they were still continually going into work if they still were working. So I don't know we'll have to monitor to see if the debt levels keep going up or if they stabilize, the new debt issuances stabilize as our interest rates slowly creep up in the late 2022 and early 2023 years.
Great. We have time for maybe one more question. And since I don't see another one on the list, I'll ask it myself. And that is about the CFPB. I gather that quite a bit of opposition to it is motivated not by a concern about its purpose, but instead about the structure and the fact that it's not really under the oversight of the executive or the legislative or the judicial branch. It kind of floats free from the governmental structure. And I wonder if you see that as a major issue and if you would suggest a place to put it so that that objection would not worry people.
I definitely believe, I agree with you. The main issue I have with it is the idea that it could just be a tool for each party to just simply come in and be like, okay, we're the party that believes this thing should be getting billions and billions of dollars of fines every year. So we're going to put someone in who's just going to go out there and find every little thing they can and fine them to the nth degree. And the other party is like, we're going to put someone who hates the Bureau in there and they're going to do nothing. I don't like that it's that politicized. I don't think anyone really does. I think if it was ideally under the judicial branch, that would be amazing because it would be a little bit less politicized and it would come from more of a legal backing rather than a political backing. I think that might be a little bit of a stretch for whether or not that would ever occur. At least under the legislative branch, it's going to be more discussed, more out in the open, be subject to hearings. I feel like that would be the more safe place for it to be, the more reasonable place for it to be, so that it can continue its goal without being torn side to side by each party every time a new president steps in power.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Wonderful job.
Thank you.
And so we all applaud virtually. Now we move on to our next session. This is Morgan Grosch, who is going to be talking about sovereign debt default, fiscal policy's role and future in Greece's 21st century crisis.
Okay, hi, I'm Morgan. Really briefly, before I begin, I wanted to thank my two advisors, Dr. Daniel Neuhan and Dr. Travis Johnson, for their continued support, as well as my friends for listening to me talk about my thesis for the past year, and family, without whom I wouldn't have the privilege to do such an interesting project. With that being said, today I'm presenting on sovereign debt default, fiscal policy's role and future in Greece's 21st century crisis. First, I wanted to provide a brief timeline and overview of the 2009 Greek sovereign debt crisis, which refers to the events that took place in 2009, starting when newly elected Prime Minister Papandreou of Greece announced that Greece would no longer be able to service its government or public debt due to revised estimates to debt and the government deficit. In general, the timeline and the prevailing research really begins with 2008, the Great Recession, as a catalyst for the 2009 Greek sovereign debt crisis. And additionally, a large portion of the research focuses on the immediate aftermath of the crisis, including the Troika's bailout measures, which refers to actions taken by the European Union, European Central Bank, and International Monetary Fund to provide financing for Greece to avoid default. However, my research finds the aforementioned timeline to be far too narrow in scope, and instead views an analysis of the past 3 decades of Greece's fiscal actions as imperative to understanding the causes of the 2009 sovereign debt crisis, as well as to effectively be able to evaluate the long-term sustainability of the country's economy. So my research really will begin in the 1990s, leading up to Greece's 2001 entry into the European and Monetary Union. And additionally, to kind of round out the framing of my research project, the timeline from the previous slide really focuses a lot on the short-term liquidity shortfalls that Greece faced and the lack of monetary solutions between 2008 and 2010. Instead, my research project views fiscal policy as an important consideration for evaluating Greece's future, as well as other EU member states' ability to maintain a sustainable financial position. Thus, my thesis question is really broken into two parts. The first is, what were the effects of Greece's fiscal policies in the years preceding 2009? And in light of those findings, which I will dive into on the next slide, I look at how Greece has financially responded to the 2009 sovereign debt crisis and positioned themselves in the long run. So first, the first part of my research project, as I mentioned, is analyzing the fiscal policies that Greece implemented prior to the 2009 crisis and evaluating the causes of the crisis that can be tied to these fiscal policies. When researching, I found that fiscal policy should really be bifurcated into two different groups. The first being policies that were implemented before Greece gained entry into the European Monetary Union, and the second being once they were admitted. Within the bucket of 1994 to 2000, which begins with the Mitsotakis government taking power in 1994 and a variety of actions being taken in order to secure EMU membership. It's important to note that Greece has a legacy of very high levels of government debt to sponsor government spending. And in order to gain entry into the EMU, Greece had to comply with the Maastricht Treaty, which had a variety of stipulations regarding government debt levels, price stability, and growth. In order to meet these stipulations, Greece had to implement a variety of fiscal consolidation efforts. However, my research concluded that a variety of these policies focused only on revenue and very little on expenditure cuts, leading Greece to have the highest level of government wage bills and pension payments in the European Union upon 2001 entry. In the section of my research that focused from 2001 to 2009, it's first important to note that the consolidation efforts which were implemented prior to 2001 were largely reversed. And instead, expenditures continued to climb, specifically in the areas of government wages, state-owned enterprises, and pensions. And additionally, the tax rate increases that were seen prior to 2001 were lowered. And in conjunction with this, tax evasion continued to be a pervasive problem to collecting revenue. Once the government's deficit continued to climb and the European Union put them under a set of procedures to lower the deficit, there was a second wave of fiscal consolidation. However, these efforts were also primarily revenue driven, and there were persistent flaws in the budgeting process that happened from 2001 to 2009, making it very difficult to analyze the true effect of the minimal expenditure cuts that were implemented. Based on my analysis of Greece's fiscal policies before 2009, I have identified 6 areas of fiscal interest that I believe contributed to the 2009 Greek sovereign debt crisis. I want to give a high-level overview and emphasize the fact that the independence of data reporting, auditing, et cetera, was a big contributing factor to all other areas of fiscal policy that I identify, due to the fact that recent research has shown that all budgeting figures from the 1990s and 2000s should be subject to significant revision in order to compare them to the true state of the Greek economy. In light of this, I wanted to briefly address my research process on identifying the sustainability of Greece's post-2009 fiscal policy actions, beginning with the starting point that in 2009, as I mentioned, the debt to GDP and deficit to GDP numbers were significantly revised to over 100% and over 15% respectively. Additionally, when viewing Greece's fiscal actions after 2009, I took careful consideration of the fact that there were fiscal policy mandates through the economic adjustment programs that the Troika instituted in order to lend money to Greece. And lastly, you'll see on the right side of the screen that I analyzed the 6 different focus areas of fiscal policy and evaluated the reforms that Greece implemented within these 6 categories. Lastly, I wanted to address the persistent challenges facing Greece based on the 6 categories aforementioned. I wish I had time to go into each of the 6, but unfortunately the 8-minute window won't allow for that. So I wanted to provide a brief overview of the 3 major findings I think that are important to discuss. The first is that Greece's response to the 2009 crisis has been highly incremental and politicized, specifically in areas relating to cutting pensions, many of which go to government workers, cutting government wages, and privatizing state-owned enterprises. All have been implemented over the past 10 years. And the European Union has deemed all policy areas as delayed. Additionally, they're highly politicized in that many of these reforms are subject to intense protests and instead are only partially implemented in many instances. Additionally, the policy communication process is quite convoluted for Greece, as many times they have to communicate complex revisions to policies such as the 500 different auxiliary pensions that the country has to citizens. And unfortunately, since 2009, the government has suffered from effectively conveying the effects of such reforms on citizens' daily lives. Lastly, there are pervasive issues relating to the independence of reporting, which I mentioned was also an issue in Greece's pre-crisis fiscal policy management. Still to this day, there are many bureaucratic and politicized processes which impact all aspects of the Greek budget, but specifically those that relate to higher than average expenditures. And yeah, like I said, those are the 3, I think, major findings. Happy to dive into any of the 6 specific areas if anyone is interested after, but that concludes my presentation.
All right, thank you very much. Let me move on to questions, and again, urge you to submit them in the chat if you have questions for Morgan. The first question is this. First of all, a comment, great presentation. And the question, what is one specific fiscal policy area that you think poses challenges for Greece going forward?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to dive into that. I think so from the slide of the 6 areas that I identified as pre-2009 fiscal policy weaknesses that Greece faced, one of them was the existence of high expenditures on state-owned enterprises, which is essentially government-owned businesses in a variety of industries, whether it be ports, energy, financial services. Greece has a large government overreach into private industries. Since 2009, Greece has attempted to privatize a large portion of these companies. However, there have been some issues related to, I think, as my 3 findings said, the independence of the privatization process. For example, the existence of golden shares is something that has been really debated when it comes to private enterprises. So golden shares essentially allow the government to maintain a stake in previously owned state-owned enterprises and take actions such as like board appointments, the way that regulations affect the business. Greece historically has had a high, high incidence of golden shares. And despite the prohibition of that since 2009, Greece still owns a large share of many previously state-owned enterprises and controls a lot of the decisions that they make, like I said, related to things such as board seats. So I think that a problem going forward for Greece is still the existence of high expenditures related to state-owned enterprises, just due to the fact that that process has been highly incremental and there's still a lot of government overreach in it.
Thank you. Next question is, what inspired you or led you to choose this thesis topic?
Yeah, sure. I think in general, I found sovereign debt to be a really fascinating topic in finance. I think I was introduced to it through a variety of sources pretty early on in college, whether it be in Finance 357 with my advisor, Dr. Daniel Noyhan. We talked a lot about sovereign debt is just kind of an important, current event to look at. Additionally, on my investment team, it's a topic that we speak about a lot. So I think it was really important, especially given that Greece's impending default kind of represented one of the first true tests to the existence of the European Union and its ability to coordinate between so many countries and the different agency costs that accompany that. So I just think it's a really important and fascinating topic that also has implications for countries who are not particularly financially stable now, such as like Italy and Spain.
Thank you. The next question, how do you feel about IMF and EMU guidance and intervention in trying to help Greece get back on its feet?
Yeah, a good portion of my thesis does focus on the 3 economic adjustment programs, which is essentially the formal name for the bailout packages provided by the Troika in wake of 2009. I think many policy areas definitely, put Greece on track. Austerity measures were certainly required to cut the deficit. And although I think my thesis paints somewhat of a negative picture, especially towards government, governance and kind of just the independence of private industries in Greece, there are certainly a lot of areas that have been successful. There are successful areas of labor market reform that I think the Troika helped kind of push through different stipulations in the bailout packages. So I think in many ways, the economic adjustment programs were obviously necessary in order to stop Greece's impending default and to get them on track. But I think that there also are probably areas of improvement. There are not a lot of firm consequences associated with Greece delaying austerity measures, as seen by the fact that many policy actions were delayed through all 3 economic adjustment programs. So I think overall, austerity guidance is important. I'm not sure how consequential it was, but I do think it made a difference, especially on the topic of labor market reform is what my thesis identifies.
Thank you. Greece is one of those countries that has been politically somewhat unstable, less stable at least than most countries in Europe for some time. To what do you attribute that? What is causing that to recur over the decades? And is it something about Greek culture or the Greek system of government, or maybe the entwining of the economy with the government? Do you have any insights into why Greece poses special problems?
I think to be honest, I didn't really analyze so much the culture of the Greek constituency as much as I did sort of, just how the political bureaucracy works in implementing fiscal policy. But I think your suggestion that there is kind of a strong overlap between government decision makers and the constituency is true. A large, portion of government jobs are unionized. They have access to, government pensions, which have been a really contentious point of fiscal policy. So I think in terms of how it relates to my thesis is reform has been quite difficult because of that overlap. In terms of just the tumultuousness of the Greek politics, I think there has been obviously a wave of anti-austerity movements across Greece, especially in light of the fact that experiencing a recession and then experiencing mandated austerity measures at the same time is a very difficult experience for a country to go through. And as a result, Greece had very high levels of unemployment, as well as kind of declining statistics and indicators on welfare related for their public. So I think that, in general, that has led an anti-austerity movement in Greece to really affect the way that the government can function, and obviously affect elections too, with the rise of the Syriza party, the re-election of the PASIC party. So yeah, I think there are a lot of reasons. I think anti-austerity politics in particular was something that I thought was interesting to look at, and its effects on the government's ability to successfully legislate.
Oh, thank you. You mentioned near the end that there was a connection you saw between what has happened in Greece and what could happen in Italy, Spain, or some other countries that also face similar economic situations. And who knows, maybe soon that will be the United States too. So do you have any do you have any advice for countries like Italy or Spain about how to avoid becoming Greece?
Yeah, I think definitely a finding that seems to have implications for other countries relates to the independence and reliability of budget auditing and just the budget creation process in general. I think prior to 2009, there were very few institutional safeguards to make sure that national statistics authorities were actually producing budgetary information that was honestly even remotely accurate. So I think a good first place to start would be to continue to reform and hold accountable national statistics institutes. I know in Italy and Spain, there have been similar controversies about information related to the deficit and general government debt levels. So I think that's a good place just because it is very difficult, I think, to get ahead of a sovereign debt crisis when you don't have a solid picture of the country's economic state. So I think that's a finding that would definitely have implications for other countries.
All right, thank you, Morgan. Well, this concludes our session on finance and economics. I want to thank everybody who's been here, who's participated, and especially thank all of those who gave presentations and did such a wonderful job, not only at presenting, but answering questions. So cheers to you all, and thank you.